Hello, everybody, and welcome to another session or chapter of White Zulu. I'm Fiona Timms, or White Zulu, and I hope you're enjoying these readings from my autobiography. This one is chapter 18, and it's called The Oyo and a Christmas Party. I was 5, going on 6 years old. It was a sweltering hot afternoon with no breeze to rustle the dry greenish-blue eucalyptus leaves or give us some respite from the sun's scorching heat. Evelina and Lisho sat chatting on their grass mats just behind me, their sturdy dark brown legs stretched out in front with their ankles crossed and their backs resting against the massive, smooth grey tree trunk. They were threading tiny, multicolored beads onto the outer edges of crocheted cotton circles, which they made to keep flies out of jugs and bowls, and sold them to Mum, Mrs. Bannatyne, and the nuns for a few pennies each. These adorned every milk jug, jam, and sugar bowl which appeared on tea trays on the dining room tables. My little sister Delia, 3.5 years younger than I, lay sleeping on a rug next to Lisho. She was wearing just a romper suit made from a pink cotton material, sprigged with tiny scarlet rosebuds. Her bare legs sprawled on the rough green and red tartan blanket, and her fine white blonde hair, tousled and pale, twisted tendrils stuck to her damp cheek, flushed and moist from the searing heat, which managed to bore between the gum leaves and radiate off the hard-baked ground. I was in a pair of khaki shorts and a pale blue t-shirt, and I was bored. Deela looked very vulnerable lying there, and I toyed with the idea of tickling her ankle with a twig I'd picked up to make her think there was something crawling on her bare skin. Amongst almost everything else, she was terrified of spiders. So much so that even if she walked into a web, she went hysterical, clawing at her face and screaming with terror. I always found this phobia of hers highly amusing and laughed at her as she ran around in panicked circles, hands clutching frantically at her pink cheeks to rid herself of the fine, sticky, silvery strands. I looked at our nannies chatting contentedly as their fingers worked busily through the rainbow of beads, and decided instead to draw an elaborate picture in the gingery red dust with my twig, while I listened to the Zulu conversation going on behind me. When lawful, I heard the oyo again last night. It made me go cold with fright and start to shiver, said Lisho. How? Wenyanga, dati wetu. My sister, me too. We'll have to bring the cattle closer to our huts or we'll have no milk, replied Evelina. When Ndlovu was Lisho's Uspongo, her tribal surname, meaning the moon. I've got that wrong. Unanga, was Lishos or Spongo, meaning the moon. Evelina's surname translated as elephant in Ndlovu, and this is how they addressed each other. Zulus give their newborn babies a traditional Zulu name, often corresponding to the baby's surroundings or even weather conditions at the birth. Dumasan is a common name for boys, Duma meaning thunder. Other names like Jabu or Jabulani for girls describe joy or happiness. And there are other variations such as Toliwe, which means something found. Then it's common practice for a mother to give her baby an English name as well. There are boys called Joseph, Ezekiel, or Jeremiah, and many other Old Testament names. Other English names, such as Miriam, Joseph, and so on, are taken from the New Testament. Happiness, togetherness, patience, and even Sixpence and Shorty are popular English names for the Zulus. On top of both names, English and Zulu, they all have Uspongo, a tribal surname. Thus, people like our cook was called Benjamin Bogiti Masango. Out of respect, we white children had to call them by their Christian names. There were a few exceptions, though, such as Makai and Lokatia, who didn't have English names. But if we called Masangu by his Zulu name, Bogiti, he reacted by threatening us with whatever kitchen utensil came to hand and called us cheeky little brats in Zulu as we scampered out of his way. I'd been lying on my elbows in the dust, bare legs crossed up in the air and absorbed in my drawing. Hearing the conversation, I looked up startled. "Why no milk?" I asked. I, too, had also heard the loud, echoing yelp of the Oyo, repeating its name over and over through the darkness, becoming nearer and louder each time it called. My father told me that the Oyo is a big grasshopper with an inflated balloon-like abdomen. It makes its call by rubbing its back legs against its belly, which amplifies the noise and makes it carry so far. I intoned, parroting this information with all the importance of a precocious 5-year-old. I didn't know the Zulu word for abdomen, so I said buttocks. Aibo. Aye, a grasshopper with buttocks, exclaimed Evelina. No, everybody knows it's a big, big black snake. Yes, added Lisha. It carries a big, bright lamp on its head, and it comes sliding out of the river on the darkest nights. I sat up, my twig discarded and my eyes wide. My blood had run cold. "Why does it come out of the river?" I quavered nervously. "This snake is very, very big and it likes milk," Evelina explained, putting down her beadwork and stretching her plump brown arms wide to demonstrate the length of this huge snake they called the Oyo. Lisha gave an exaggerated shudder and drew her dusty bare feet back underneath her and onto her woven grass mat at the very thought of the snake. "A black mamba?" I asked. I'd read about mambas in my father's snake book, which he kept on the telephone shelf in his office, along with the snake bite kit, a tin box containing a rubber tourniquet, a razor blade, a large syringe, and a rubber-sealed glass of vial of polyvalent antivenom, meaning it was effective for treating the two main snake bites of our particular region. The snake book showed all the most venomous snakes in southern Africa in descending order of how lethal they are. The black mamba took pride of place on the frontispiece, followed in venomousness by the green mamba. The text under the picture of both snakes said, "If bitten by either of these mambas, the victim has 10 minutes to find the antidote and inject it above the bite area before he becomes paralyzed and dies." Everybody, even the Zulus, called it the 10-minute snake. I was fascinated with the tin, which had a picture of a rearing Cape cobra on the lid, with its hood spread out, spitting, and when there was nobody about, I dragged the swivel chair from its place at my father's big roll-top desk, and by climbing on it, could reach the snakebite outfit. I went through the items in the tin box and pored over the colourful illustrations in the leaflet. One of my favourites, along with a huge tome called Sheep Management and Diseases, which had brightly coloured, lurid photos of the many gruesome ailments which my father said his sheep were so good at contracting. The leaflet also explains that polyvalent antivenom is created by injecting minute amounts of venom into horses, which then generated the antidote in their blood, which was then drawn, and the serum separated by centrifugal means. I'd decided that I was going to be a vet when I grew up, and I read all this grisly information over and over again, saying the longer words out loud under my breath, whispering the wonderful, exciting medical terms to myself until I could repeat it all verbatim. I spent hours fantasizing, imagining myself in a crisp white coat, stethoscope around my neck, presiding over a gleaming, sterile veterinary surgery. Polyvalent antivenom venom is effective for treating the two main snake bites of that particular geographical area. Or should I say this, as the farm is still there. Mambas and cobras, among many other snakes, deliver neurotoxic venom, which attacks the victim's entire nervous system, shutting down vital organs by paralyzing the lungs and thus immobilizing the respiratory system. Quite quickly, the venom reaches the brain via the bloodstream and effectively paralyzes it completely, killing the victim. I read too that vipers, such as our common puff adders and the more sinister night adders, insinuated themselves into houses at night to hunt for rodents and could be found slithering silently alongside one's bed. An unwary bare foot could easily step on the snake as the victim got out of bed in the dark for an innocuous visit to the bathroom, and in that way provoke a bite. This was designed to paralyze a rat or mouse and then turn their flesh to liquid, effectively pre-digesting the creature before the snake swallows it whole. In a human, this venom has the effect of turning the foot into a huge, swollen, purple mass as the weakened blood vessels leak blood into the surrounding flesh, which turns to soft jelly. An agonizing process which, if not treated instantly, invariably culminates with the limb turning gangrenous and needing amputation, a life-saving operation, before the gangrene spreads further. I'd questioned Grandpa about mambas, and he reassured me that as they were coastal snakes and pretty much inland in the Kruger Park area, or Lowveld, they preferred a hotter climate to ours. Neither he nor his father had ever heard of one being seen around these parts. Now, here I was, being told about this sinister black snake. I digested this piece of information for a while, abstractedly scratching an intricate pattern in the powdery red dust with my twig. The sun was settling below the mountain behind the house, and a cooler breeze was rustling the dry gum leaves, releasing the pleasantly pungent aroma of eucalyptus. It was getting on for our bath time. During the evening, I was very quiet as Evelina bathed us. Delia first and then me, dressed us in cotton shorty pajamas, then sent us running and skidding on the grass mats along the polished wooden floor of the wide passage which leads to the sitting room, where our parents were settled with their first whiskey and water of the evening. I stopped halfway down the passage at the stable door, which leads out to the back veranda. There is a neat round chunk gouged out of the wooden step where a year before Grandpa had blasted the head off Ubulula, a puff adder, with his 12-bore shotgun. The snake had been trying to get into the house where it would be sheltered from the cooling night air. Grandpa knew a lot about snakes. My heel fitted exactly into the hole in the step, and for a moment I stood there thoughtfully, picturing in my mind the thick, sluggish, zigzag patterned puff adder. I knew the Zulus didn't mind snakes around their kraals. They kept the population down, but puff adders were a different matter. Their lazy manner of lying well camouflaged in pathways, basking on the warm ground, combined with their lightning quick and deadly strike at a careless foot, makes them, according to the snake book, the most common cause of snakebite deaths in the country. Everybody on the farm killed puff adders they found around the farmstead. We don't anymore. We keep snakes, we leave them alone. And I'd seen many desiccated ubululu skins nailed to the mud huts of the Zulus round, the mud walls of the Zulus round huts, to serve as a warning to other adders. The older Zulus used the snake fat to ease rheumatism in their joints, and they also took the poison glands out and dried and ground the contents into powder to use as muti, witchcraft medicine, and many of them wore the fangs for charms. With our parents for our obligatory half hour before bedtime, listening to our mother read Pookie to us, the coziness of the so-called adventures of those twee English woodland creatures, of rabbits, squirrels, and elves, only served to contrast now with my own alarming recollection of what Evelina had told me about the Oyo. It was a warm night, and after I'd performed my ritual of simultaneously reaching the light off, switching the light off at the wall near the door and leaping from the switch onto my bed, so that whatever hideous creature which lay in wait under the night frill wouldn't have a chance to grab my ankles. I lay down with just a cotton sheet over me and picked up a book from my bedside table. I spent as long as I could reading by the crack of light that comes from the passage through my half-open door, until my eyes ached. My mother had confiscated my bedside lamp weeks ago when she discovered that I was reading all night, engrossed in one of my father's books about the Second World War. She'd wondered why I appeared so pale and red-eyed every morning, crabby and more quarrelsome than usual with Delia. Finally, the words began to dance in front of my eyes, and the book slipped from my fingers. Now I was wide awake again, startled by the first call of the Oyo right beneath the big open sash window of my bedroom at the very end of the house. I pictured the enormous, thick black snake rising out of the waters of the river below the house. The river below the house. It's just behind me, actually. The river against the bush. A glowing lamp shining a yellowish beam from its big head. I tightened my grip on the flimsy sheet I'd pulled over my head and lay still, hardly daring to breathe. And what could it be that had disturbed the crickets? Usually, while the Oyo was yelping out its horrible call, Oyo, 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 constantly. Crickets and tree frogs carried on their quiet background static. Now they were silent, which was most odd. I lay under my sheet, rigid with fright. It was pitch dark outside, and everything that had sounded normal as I'd fallen asleep, with the usual shrill chirping of crickets and the peep peep song of tree frogs chiming outside my bedroom window. I'd woken with a jolt to find there wasn't a sound. There was an ominous quiet out there, which meant something big was close enough to frighten them into silence. Could hear the Oyo calling, though. It was all very well, I thought frantically, Evelina telling me about the big black snake, but Zulu children went to bed in their huts and slept very close to their mothers, while we white children had our bedrooms on the far side of the house, well out of our parents' earshot, and that was deliberate. I heard a rustling noise in the hydrangea bush just beneath the window sill and a loud snort. Oh my God, I whimpered to myself. Was it the snake or a leopard? I knew that leopards prowled around in the dark too, seeking out a tasty young baboon to drag out of the big treetops in which the troop cowered at night. The dogs usually warned us by barking furiously when they detected the unmistakable scent of the big cat, but they weren't making a sound. My father and grandpa had reassured us that the leopards didn't come into the garden, but stayed in the bush across the river, stalking through the darkness to snatch a sleeping baboon. But could they be wrong? Would a leopard drag me out of my bed and carry me off? I wondered if I should jump out of bed and race down the passage to our parents' room on the other side of the big rambling house. This would be a last resort, as we all knew that we were only ever to disturb them if one of us was very, very sick or dying. I weighed up the consequences of knocking on their door and waking them, and decided to stick it out where I was. Then I heard a gushing noise and something that sounded like water being poured onto the plants just outside my window. This didn't tie in with snakes or leopards, and while I was lying still, trying to puzzle out the sound, I fell asleep. Early the next morning, I was woken by my mother rampaging around outside, shouting for Jomela. "That bloody great bull got into the garden last night," she shouted crossly to me through my window. "Just look at those deep hoof prints in the lawn, and the mess he's made of the wall where he's splashed the whitewash by whittling next to it, and he's eaten most of my lovely herbaceous border. One of the farm boys must have left the gate open. Damn it." And she went off, still ranting. I put the pillow over my head and tried to recapture that nice sleepy feeling I'd been experiencing before I'd been jerked awake. But it was no good. I was wide awake now. The Christmas party. That December, a few days before Christmas, I woke with the cicadas' constant shrill shimmering through the air. The sun was already blazing high over the valley, and the day promised to be another scorcher. I hopped out of bed and ran down the long passage and out onto the back veranda, where Evelina was pressing a dress. I recognized it as one that had been handed down to me from a cousin in England. Liberty print smock with puffed sleeves and a sash. I hated it and had already surreptitiously trying to ruin it by spending the afternoon at a polo tournament, sliding down a bank with some other children, sitting on flat pieces of cardboard and ripping the dress in the process. I was 6 years old. I'd been told to stay within earshot because we were going out later. So I spent most of the morning mooching around at the back of the house, kicking aimlessly at the flowering shrubs and playing with the equally bored pointers, Rufus and Radar, because by that time we would have been far away, out in the bush looking for snares. A long strip of silvery paper-like bark which had unpeeled from one of the towering gum trees which shaded the house, and ran around in circles, dragging it behind me on the grass. Dogs good-naturedly chased the bark jumping onto it with both front paws, growling and worrying it with their teeth. Eventually the bark broke and I grew dizzy, spinning now with the short remainder in my hand. As I fell onto the grass, Radar pounced on the fragment I held and snapped at it. He accidentally bit my small fist, none too gently, and with a howl of rage I tackled him, pinned him down, and bit hard on the loose skin at the back of his neck, making him yelp. His coat tasted horrible, a mixture of Jay's fluid, with which the dogs were bathed regularly to control the many blue ticks they picked up every day, and muddy water from the small dam, green with algae, into which the dogs plunged on the way home from one of our rides. Instantly I felt guilty at hurting Radar and stroked his soft velvety ears, murmuring sweetly to him as we both lay panting in the shade. Evelina called to me to come inside and get out of my shorts and t-shirt. I hopped excitedly around the room while she tried to wipe my face with a wet flannel and clicked in annoyance at the grass stains on my knees. Finally, I was wrestled into my dress, my short hair brushed, and after strapping on a pair of ugly brown sandals, I raced out to where the car was waiting. Mum drove the big Chev with both my older sisters sitting in front, me on the back seat, and Delia was on Evelina's lap. We arrived at the Farmers' Hall in Nottingham Road, a big brick building with a corrugated iron roof and a veranda all the way round, supported by wooden pillars. There were already quite a few cars and bakkies parked haphazardly in the shade of some gum trees. Mum stopped the car and we all climbed out, our clothes already creased and a film of red dust over our sweating faces from the half-hour drive from the farm. Evelina carried Delia as we joined a cluster of other mothers and children, standing and waiting on the shiny red polished concrete floor of the hall veranda. Everybody was watching a gap in the 5-strand barbed wire fence which surrounded the grounds of the hall, through which a strange procession was making its way. Leading a dejected-looking, droopy-eared old donkey was a clown with a big bulbous red nose and huge feet, his white painted makeup glistening with sweat. The donkey was pulling a small cart in which was seated another clown and Father Christmas holding a big bulging red sack. With a lot of shouting and gesticulating, the first clown pulled the donkey to a halt at the foot of the steps leading to the veranda. The clown in the cart stood up and wobbled about before he performed an untidy back somersault off the tailgate, landing unsteadily on his long flappy shoes. There was a scattering of applause from the mothers, which was enough to encourage the other clown, standing at the bottom of the steps, to try a somersault of his own. He went down with a thud onto the hard, sun-baked earth, sending up a small cloud of red dust, and lay there laughing helplessly. By now, I had shrunk back into Evelina's white pinafore. She was no less alarmed at seeing white men behaving in such an extraordinary and undignified manner, and I could feel her legs tense and hear her breathing fast. When I looked up at her face, all I could see were the whites of her eyes. One of the women called out, "Garth, Andy, have you guys come via Notties?" Notties is the pub attached to the Nottingham Road Hotel. "Fortified yourselves a bit for this?" laughed another. Sheepishly, both clowns got up, dusted themselves off, and helped Father Christmas out of the cart. He climbed the steps, the sack over his shoulder, and sat down on a wooden bench on the veranda. At the same time, an apparition materialized in the open doorway leading to the cooler gloom of the hall. It was the Christmas fairy, a girl I knew by sight, the local GP's daughter, and the same age as myself. He was dressed in a stiff white net ballet tutu, wore pink tights, and had pink ballet slippers on, with the silk ribbons crisscrossed up to her knees. Strapped to her back, she had big silvery gossamer wings, and she wore a tinsel crown. In one hand she carried a silver wand topped by a glittering star. The fairy opened the sack, pulled out a present, read the label, and whispered to Father Christmas. He called out each child's name, and they came forward meekly, were handed a gift, and returned to their mothers to unwrap it. When Delia's name was called, Mum indicated to Evelina that she must take her to collect her present. Hesitantly, our nanny walked forward to the seated figure. "And what is your name, little girl?" asked the bearded man, peering into Delia's face, his white whiskers slipping around on his ruddy face, slick with rivulets of perspiration which coursed into his beard, and his beery breath blowing her fine pale hair off her terrified face. It must have been 38 degrees centigrade in the shade, and he was dressed in a red hooded velvet robe, wore long red trousers tucked into black gumboots. Whichever young dad had volunteered for this annual event needed a medal. The clowns had a slightly better deal, as they could jump around, even though their pancake makeup was now streaked and blurred. Delia let out a howl of terror and buried her face in Evelina's blue overalled shoulder. Our nanny snatched the proffered gift and half ran back to where we stood watching. "Take her to the car," hissed Mum in Zulu. And Evelina scuffled off as fast as her bulk would allow, carrying the still wailing child to the safety of the parking area to sit in the shade there. All this time, I'd been staring open mouthed at the fairy. Oh, how I envied her. I'd often dreamt of wearing such an outfit. I wanted to learn ballet simply because I wanted to wear a little tutu with the many layers of net standing proud from the shiny bodice, like I'd seen in one of my older sister's books. I wrenched crossly at my own flower-sprigged smock, hating it, hating Mum for making me wear it. I wanted frills, frothy petticoats, lacy ankle socks, and dainty little slippers, instead of these clumsy, clumpy, brown Clark's sandals with their thick rubber soles. The fairy even had long hair, something else I'd always hankered for. But Mum insisted that we had our hair cut short. Long hair on little girls was common. After the last present had been handed out, we were ushered into the hall, where there was a wonderful spread of party food and many coloured bottles of Sparletta cool drinks with straws sticking out. There were iced zoo animal biscuits and even chips, which we call crisps here, among the sausage rolls and tiny sandwiches. We never had these treats on the farm, and I ate and ate until my stomach hurt. While I was shoving a handful of crisps into my mouth, I looked around, and out of the window at the back of the hall, I saw Father Christmas and both clowns lounging against the wooden poles which support the back veranda, chatting, laughing, and drinking from cans of cold castle lager. I turned my attention back to the hall and saw the Christmas fairy standing, nibbling daintily on a slice of cake while turning little pirouettes on the shiny floor. I walked up to her and stood in front of her, hands on my hips. "Give me a go with your wand," I asked, firmly, but reasonably politely for me. "No," was the answer. I had a perverse nature, and when offered the option of behaving well or badly, I always chose the latter. Perhaps because my sisters were so obedient and acquiescent, I always had an overwhelming urge to rebel. I made a grab for the wand, too quickly for her to be able to snatch it away. I tried to wrestle it out of her hand, but she wouldn't let go and lost her footing on the slippery floor in those pretty little ballet pumps. As she fell, I landed on top of her. She still hung on tightly to the wand, so I sank my teeth into her hand and bit hard. She screamed, and half a dozen mothers rushed over to remove me and comfort her. Tight-lipped, Mum dragged me out of the hall, her fingers clamped vice-like around my upper arm and my feet paddling in the air. I was made to spend the rest of the afternoon sitting in the shade of the gum trees with Evelina and Delia in disgrace and awaiting the inevitable long lecture from Mum all the way home on my appalling bad behaviour. I never went to another Christmas party again. That's all for this time. I want to thank John Muslane very much for helping me make these videos. He gives up his Friday afternoons religiously for me. Thank you, John. My website is www.whitezulubook.com. And I want to thank you for listening to my stories and chapters of my autobiography. And I hope you're enjoying them. And I'll see you next time. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.